Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to introduce the Henry Hazlitt Memorial Lecture. Carolyn Baum is a columnist at Bloomberg News, where she has worked since 1998 after spending 11 years at Dow Jones. Her work has appeared in Barron's, The National Review, Bloomberg Markets, Bloomberg Personal, and the International Economy. In April 1996, Worth magazine profiled Ms. Baum as the Merry Mistress of Bonds. Ms. Baum appears regularly on Bloomberg TV and radio. From March 2002 to August 2003, she hosted her own weekend radio talk show, No Nonsense. She makes guest appearances on NPR and local business and financial news radio across the country. Her book, Just What I Said, was published in August 2005, and we have copies downstairs. The National Headliners Club recognized Ms. Baum's work with consecutive first-place awards in 2004 and 2005 for her wire service commentary. She won the Newswoman's Club of New York first-place award for wire service commentary in 2001 and then again in 2006. Ms. Baum holds a BA in political science from Tufts University and an MA in cinema studies from New York University. Her postgraduate education includes courses in nonfiction writing, economics, and technical analysis. She will speak to us on Still Nonsense after all these years. Please help me welcome Carolyn Baum.
Let me get set up here. How's the sound? Okay. Okay. All right. Anyway, it's a pleasure and where are the women? I don't say. Oh, good. Okay. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be here today. I have never given a named lecture before. You know, I've given lots of speeches and I've lectured at universities. I've been the keynote speaker and I've been a luncheon speaker, the only qualification for which seems to be to prevent the audience from going to sleep after the meal. But it's a special honor to be asked to give a named lecture when the name attached to it is someone as distinguished as Henry Hazlitt, economist, journalist, economic journalist. Now, I first read economics in one lesson about 20 years ago when I was just starting my real economics education, you know, not the stuff they teach you in school. In preparation for my talk, I decided I would go back and read it. Now, imagine my surprise and my horror when I learned that some of my best ideas are derived from him. You know, and here I thought I was being original all these years. Anyway, for example, Hazlitt's penchant for looking at a policy and carrying it through to its logical conclusion and seeing how all groups are affected. I remember back in 1992, right after Hurricane Andrew. It was a Category 5, very powerful hurricane, swept the coast of Florida, left a lot of devastation and destruction in its wake. And I remember turning on CNBC, and the anchor was going on and on about, you know, how, this is great news for GDP. You know, and I guess in a very Hazlitt attribution, not even knowing it at the time, I remember writing something like, well, you know, if natural disasters are so good for the economy, why sit around and wait for acts of God to occur? Why not nuke our own cities and then we can build them? I mean, I don't have to tell this audience that wealth destruction is not good. When you have a hurricane, you know, you may get more housing starts, but you don't have any more net new homes. Industrial production goes up, doesn't add to the capital stock. You know, destruction of wealth is not good. Why it's good to use scarce resources to get back to square one is just anybody's guess. Anyway, bad ideas like this never die, and bad economic ideas have a way of coming back in a little bit different form at as if on cue at certain times in the business cycle or in response to certain events such as hurricanes. As a financial journalist, I've always had fun trying to upend economic nonsense. I was leafing through my book, which Joe mentioned. It's a book of columns published in 2005 that Mises Institute was good enough to stock in their library. And I was leafing through the book, and I noticed a headline that I wrote in the aftermath of Hurricane Floyd in 1999. And the headline for this column was, "Hurricane Sweeps Coast, Nonsense Sure to Follow." And it did. You know, we had the whole thing again about how this was going to be good for GDP. Anyway, that column is in a chapter that I entitled, "Still Nonsense After All These Years," and I thought that would be a good topic for today's talk. Now, I know this audience, above all others, will appreciate some of the economic nonsense that passes for commentary and analysis. 3 years ago, I had the misfortune to review a book by a well-known financial journalist on why bubbles were good for the economy. I kid you not. I mean, the title was "Pop, Why Bubbles Are Great for the Economy." And the author made an argument that investment bubbles leave behind a usable infrastructure, which are a net positive. For example, the tech bubble that burst in 2000. I remember reading we had enough unused fiber optic cable to go to the moon and back 6 times. Well, according to this author, you know, when something like that happens, a whole new generation of entrepreneurs can come in and they can pick up equipment, office space, and talent on the cheap. In other words, out of the ashes of Global Crossing sprang Google. Well, what about the cost? Hazlitt probably would have said that investors overpaid for resources that were underutilized, sometimes for years. Price signals were distorted just as they are with inflation, and wealth destruction is not good. The author of the Bubbles Are Good Doctrine book had a lot of trouble when it came to defending the housing bubble in 2007. It was already deflating then. And I pulled out this quote to read to you. This is what he says about the benefits of the housing bubble. Quote, "The bubble achieved a goal that billions of federal dollars and 30 years of good intentions could not. Gentrification and renewal in formerly some of the most wretched spots of cities, unquote. Ashes to ashes, dust to dust, wretched to wretched." I wonder what he'd say now about the blocks of urban blight and foreclosure signs. I mean, even when I reviewed the book, I remember including at that time in 2007 some snarky comment to the effect that I hope his publicist didn't schedule too many book events in Phoenix, Las Vegas, or Fort Myers, Florida, which was ground zero for all that gentrification he talked about. All right, fast forward to Haiti's devastating earthquake earlier this year. And the Wall Street Journal dragged out the bubbles are good, disasters are good argument in a long weekend section essay. This time the author was a professor of American Studies, and he actually invoked Schumpeter's gale of creative destruction in support of his thesis. Now, I'm no authority on Schumpeter, but I suspect his gale didn't include high force winds. Rather, it was a process by which capitalist economies progress, with innovation leading to the creation of entire new industries and the demise of superfluous ones. Okay, enough on the subject of destruction is good. Let's turn to another one of my favorite pieces of nonsense, something that I've labeled loop-de-loop economics. Now, this school of thought seems to think that prices rise and fall on their own accord and that cause and effect are one and the same. Let me give you a couple of examples. Oil prices, okay. The idea, and it's promulgated in every newspaper, every news wire, and a lot of economic research, that higher oil prices slow the economy and lower oil prices stimulate it. Well, it makes you wonder about why we spend so much time worrying about the Federal Reserve if OPEC can run monetary policy. It's dangerous, actually, to sleep through Econ 101, especially the micro stuff. And I always like to tell people, if you mastered the law of supply and demand, you'll be far ahead of most of the PhDs on Wall Street, who don't seem to know the difference between a shift in the curve and a movement along the curve. Now look, if the price of oil rises because we all want to consume more oil at any given price than we did before, it's an outward shift in the demand curve. We get a higher price, a higher quantity demanded. So you can't argue in the same breath that the increased demand that led to a higher price, the higher price is now going to lead to reduced demand. I mean, they aren't the same things. But economists do just that. They can't differentiate between a higher price when you shift the demand curve out to a higher price when you're moving inward along the demand curve, a supply shock. It may be the same price, but it's not the same outcome. Anyway, I always mean to ask some of these people how we ever get out of this closed loop with higher prices slowing demand and lower prices increasing demand. And then there's the question if they talk as if this revenue disappears from higher oil prices. I mean, it doesn't. It goes somewhere. It may be a transfer from consumers to producers, but producers increase dividends, so shareholders, consumers benefit, or they invest in research and development, in which case they hire people and pay them a salary. Even if it goes overseas, the money still doesn't go into the ground. The profits don't go into the ground. Comes back here in terms of securities purchase or foreign direct investment. So just to summarize loop-de-loop as it pertains to oil prices, higher oil prices slow the economy, lower oil prices stimulate it. You have to wonder why some bureaucrat hasn't decided to search for the perfect oil price that will keep the economy growing at its potential in perpetuity, if it's so easy. Now, this thinking doesn't just apply to oil prices. I saw it applied to housing prices about a year ago. Various analysts were quoted, sounding very authoritative, saying that home sales are not going to pick up until house prices stop falling. Okay, so why did prices start falling in the first place? More sellers than buyers. Now, I understand that potential homeowners, like investors, may not be bottom pickers. They may be happier buying a trending market. But with foreclosed homes being added to the already bloated inventory, home prices are not going to start rising until demand picks up. Now, what really gets me is when you translate this thinking to long-term interest rates. And then it's enough to make your mind spin. Higher long-term rates slow the economy, lower long-term rates give it a boost. Once again, why do we have a central bank? That's not a question for this audience. That's not appropriate. For most audiences, I could ask it. Why do we have a central bank that is constantly trying to find the appropriate short-term interest rate if long-term interest rates are what matter? Look, when you have a monopolist in the short end of the yield curve, the long rate serves as a kind of gauge on what the central bank is doing. Knut Wicksell, Austrian, socialist Austrian, but an Austrian nevertheless. Wicksell called it the natural rate and the bank rate or the money rate. And he saw a value in that relationship, which nowadays is known as the spread, the yield curve, or in academic circles, the term structure of interest rates. The long-term long-term interest rates can rise again because of increased demand or decreased supply. fewer people willing to lend to the U.S. government. Now, how can you tell with something as vast as the credit market whether long-term rates rising, what the source of it is? Well, you don't need a treasury finance or a budget expert. The Fed will do that for you. I mean, if market interest rates are rising out the curve, if all rates are rising, and the short-term rate is the one controlled by the central bank is not rising, you can be pretty sure that a steeper yield curve is expansionary. Because what it means is the short rate would be rising if the Fed weren't pumping out sufficient reserves to keep it from doing so. So, a steeper yield curve, the spread, it reflects the stance of monetary policy. Now, the loop-de-loopers like to look at long-term rates in isolation, just like oil and house prices. And in every cycle, when the yield curve inverts, as it ultimately does, the cries go out that this time is different. An inverted yield curve does not mean what it meant previously. And especially now if the economic statistics look good. And sure enough, as night follows day, the curve inverts, the expansion ends, recession begins. And it is interesting because the official date of the last recession, December 2007, the long-term treasury yield was yielding about 4%. And I remember I write about the yield curve frequently, and I remember having a lot of arguments with people saying to me, the economy does not go in recession when long-term interest rates are at 4%. So be it. While we're on the subject of long-term interest rates, I want to talk about another subject near and dear to my heart, the bond vigilantes, another nonsensical concept. Presumably, these self-appointed gunslingers roam the globe in search of irresponsible governments and look to impose some discipline on them. And the idea was introduced by economist Ed Yardeni in 1983. And the idea was something that if the monetary or fiscal authorities weren't doing their job, the credit market vigilantes could do it for them and impose some discipline. Sorry, Ed. A trader selling bonds and a central bank with a printing press are not fungible. In fact, if the central bank is inflating, the public will expect inflation to be higher, will spend more today because it's going to cost more tomorrow, long-term interest rates notwithstanding. And a steeper yield curve, all things equal, will induce banks to create more credit, assuming that they are not balance sheet constrained, as they were coming out of the 1990 recession and the current one. Now, the vigilantes may have gone underground during the Great Moderation, but they too did not die. Instead, they get hauled out every time people are worried about easy money or fiscal spending. When they do, I'm always reminded of my late friend and economics teacher, Bob Laurent, who wrote under Milton Friedman. He was the best monetary economist I knew, taught me economics on the phone over the years. And he's certainly the last person to advocate the idea that the central bank, that bond traders can do the central bank's job. And I remember I used to call him up when the nonsense would start, and he would always chuckle and he'd say, I have to wonder why, like, some of these markets like Brazil or these hyperinflating Latin American economies, why the vigilantes can't work their wonders there. Now, the good news is I do hear the vigilantes have been cited in Greece, and I imagine that there's enough work in Zimbabwe to keep them busy for a long time. While we're on the subject of inflation, another one of my favorites, and we have to deal with this several times in each expansion, is that beast known as wage inflation. Of course, there is no wage inflation. It doesn't exist. Wages are a price. They're the price of labor. They happen to be a big input price, especially in services, in the services industry, but they don't cause anything. And in order to believe that wages push up prices, that thing called cost push inflation, you'd have to think that businesses are dumb enough to pay someone more than their marginal revenue product. In other words, they're going to pay someone to reduce their profits, and that just doesn't make sense. It would be one thing if we lived in a world where the unions had great sway, but in a globalized economy and union membership down, this idea of wage inflation still persists, and it shows up of all places in the Federal Reserve minutes, with the Fed wondering about, what the effect of higher oil prices and higher wages is going to be on inflation, as if these were exogenous forces unrelated to anything that the Fed does. Another one of my favorite pieces of nonsense is the idea that there is a fixed amount of work, that if we could just curtail immigration or restrict trade, there would be more jobs for more Americans. Now, this one actually has a name. I had to make up loop-de-loop, but this one is called the lump of labor fallacy. And France fell victim to the lump of labor fallacy about a little over a decade ago when the socialist government decided to reduce the work week from 40 hours to 35 hours. And the logic went like this. If it takes one man 40 hours to do a job and one man is limited to 35 hours, it'll take 1.14 men to do the equivalent of 40 hours of work. Of course, the flaw in the logic is that 1.14 men need two benefit packages. So the 35-hour work week has been effectively repealed, but not before the French took to the streets to protest the forced erosion in their quality of life. Now, the lump of labor fallacy was revived in 2001, the jobless recovery, except this time it was productivity growth that was the enemy of hiring. And of course, expansions with the strongest rebounds in productivity seem to also have the strongest hiring, but don't let the facts get in the way of a good story. I mean, even if immigrants displace American workers, they increase the size of the economy, which adds new jobs. I think it was Milton Friedman who said, it's really not tough if you want to create work. I mean, get rid of earth-moving machines and go back to shovels, and forget the shovels and use spoons. But I mean, this is not what we're trying to do. People who think the quantity of labor is fixed probably buy into the idea that the demand for goods and services is finite as well. This piece of nonsense makes an appearance usually when the economy is struggling to rebound from recession and things aren't quite going according to plan, and usually some economist pipes up and says, well, if we didn't have a severe downturn, we can't have a good bounce back because there's no pent-up demand. And here I thought that human beings were constantly having to compromise, their infinite wants to limited resources. This idea reached its apotheosis in 2004 with the publication of a book entitled The Death of Demand. This book landed on my desk courtesy of some publisher or publicist, and the reason it piqued my interest is that the field of gloom is usually populated by Malthusians who worry about the inability to produce enough food to take care of a growing population. I mean, here was someone who actually said demand was satiated. This author argued that we had reached something called an innovation saturation, that there was nothing capable of reinvigorating the economy. Well, who knew we needed an iPod before Apple came up with an idea, successfully produced and marketed it? And even if there's nothing new, we want more of the old stuff. We want bigger houses, fancier appliances, more cars. In the 50s, it was, a car in every driveway. And that gave way to the 2-car garage, now the 3 and the 4-car garage. I always like to tell people that if I'm going to worry about something, it'll be the sun going dark in 5 billion years and not the death of demand. Of course, the list of bad ideas that never die would not be complete without mention of Keynesian economics, which, unlike its founder, is never dead in the long run. Instead, it comes... Instead, it comes back to haunt us regularly. Now, the neo-Keynesians may debate whether the spending multiplier is 1 or 1.3 or 1.5, or whether you get a bigger spending on infrastructure gives a bigger boost than transfer payments or entitlement spending. But the one thing they never, ever question is how it is that transferring money via taxation, inflation, or government borrowing can be a net positive for the economy. Bastiat laid it out 160 years ago, and broken windows are still the rage today. I could go on, but as I said in the beginning, bad economic ideas never die. I've made a career of upending economic nonsense, so I, for one, would be very sorry to see it go. And with that, I'll be happy to take your questions. Gentleman there?
Do you take Mr. Krugman's winning the Nobel Prize for Economics as positive of your thesis that bad ideas never die?
Yes, I do. You know, and readers write to me sometime, you know. We're actually at Bloomberg not allowed to criticize the media, so sometimes I kind of get away with it by saying Princeton economics professor, you know, but the editors are asleep at the wheel. But, you know, readers are just outraged, and they write, so where's your PhD that you can criticize a Nobel winner? So, yeah. Gentleman back there? Why do they never die? Because on some level, if you don't think about them, I guess it makes sense, you know, because we have to find something. Government has to do something to make it better. No one wants to undergo short-term pain, so we end up with long-term pain. So, but I don't know why they don't die. I mean, and you would think the people that promulgate them should know better. Back there? Yeah.
What would you say to that?
Yeah, I do sometimes, you know. This has been a period when there's been a lot going on. I had never written about healthcare till last year just because I can't understand my own, and I figured, you know, it was how could I write about this? But I got so angry last summer when I heard Obama wanted a bill on his desk by August 15th that I had to dive in. I don't know, you know, it's not easy cranking out. I crank out 2 columns a week. I used to write a lot more, but it was a little more market-driven and stuff. So I don't know if you'd call it writer's block, but finding, you know, an idea that is new, fresh, that you can bring a new way to, some value added to it is not easy. I mean, when I did my book is a collection of columns, but it's organized by theme, not by topic. And I remember when I put it together, I remember I came home one day and I said, you know, here I thought I wrote the same 6 columns over and over. They're actually 18, you know. So thank you. Gentleman here?
You may also answer his question back there when you answer mine. In your estimation, who benefits from or whose interests are served by the propagation of these bad economic ideas?
Well, again, I read a statistic recently that there are, you know, we're not quite at 50% yet, but 40-some-odd% pay no taxes in this country. So they benefit from bigger government and more one-sided, you know, distribution. But they're not just propagated. It's not government propaganda. The government takes the actions, but there's a lot of Keynesians on Wall Street, so I don't know why. It's just it must be a very tempting.
Just wondering if there was a symbiotic type relationship between economists promoting government deficit spending, for example,
Yeah.
and politicians getting reelected by making promises and fulfilling them with deficit spending.
I'm sure there's some of it, but this is what's taught in the schools. I mean, right? I was listening in the last month. I was listening to a Rothbard lecture that Max, a young intern at Bloomberg, who's a good Austrian at I must be 19 or something like that. Learned a lot from him, and he had sent me some links and said, "You have to listen to this." And Rothbard was talking about Mises and Hayek not being able to get hired, and salaries being paid by businesses. And he said, and yet, every Marxist could get a cushy seat at an Ivy League university. Yes, back there.
Yeah, I've written a lot on journalism itself. One of the things I've found is this really, you talk about the symbiotic relationship of economists and government. What about journalists and government officials? I remember, I'll give you an example. When Rudy Giuliani was doing, his crusade to clean up Wall Street,
Mm-hmm.
a lot of stuff was coming to the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal was illegally leaked.
Mm-hmm.
All right, and so basically what people like James Stewart and others and Laurie Cohen were doing is aiding and abetting a felony, while they're, of course, at the same time, expressing outrage that there's criminality on Wall Street.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, they get to, participate in criminality themselves. Is there, do you think, this real symbiotic relationship between, especially not the elected politicians, but often people who are appointed, people in the bureaucracy, and journalists?
Well, I think there is a trade. You get access. On the other side of the quid pro quo is information. And, I'd like to think that, I'm not a reporter in the sense, but I'm trying to think of times in my life that I've slanted something in order to get a story. I'd like to think not, and I work with some people who are adamant about on background. No, why aren't you putting your name on it? But it's more prevalent in Washington. I don't understand why, if various administrations, when classified information isn't leaked by a member of the staff and then out through the newspaper, they don't do something about it. But they don't.
If Obama does get his health care plan, what do you see the ramifications of that mean? Overall, you think health care will down, go up? Do you think there will be any ramifications within the economy itself?
Well, the taxes come first, and the additional healthcare benefits aren't fully implemented, I think, till 2014. So, as a friend of mine likes to say, the way to eternal life is as a federal government program. I suppose once it passes, it'll be hard to get rid of it, even if they clean house in the next election. I'm not an equity person in terms of how it's going to affect stock prices and what's already built into that. But from what I've learned and read, there's a lot of good ideas about how to fix healthcare out there. Why do these microcosms like the Cleveland Clinic and even the Mayo and even some county health associations deliver quality care at lower costs? But I know that with the federal government running it, it's certainly not. We're not going to find the ways to create incentives. And I even read something which I couldn't believe, that the penalty, and when Obama came out with his 12-page plan that he wants to incorporate into the health care bill, or that the CBO is now scoring, I mean, it doesn't have anything to score, but I think it's being developed, that, you know, every American must buy health care, and the penalty for not buying it is so low, I can't see why a young, healthy person would not wait till the ambulance on the way to the hospital. So there's some really bad ideas on there. You know, you read someone like the dean of the Harvard Medical School on an editorial page. He's done a couple pieces with very thoughtful ideas. I mean, I don't think the Republicans would have done anything about health care, so I don't think that's the answer either. But it seems to me that we're rushing something that's very complicated, and my personal view is that we do have a moral obligation, not a right, but a moral obligation to try and help people get access to health care, whatever that is, whether it's by a subsidy or something like that. But I think some of the things they're doing is stupid, and I don't think it'll be a net positive for the economy. Yes?
Do you think, have you noticed any increase in appreciation for the kind of Hayekian Austrian business cycle ideas, considering how...
Not at Bloomberg News, so... Yeah. Well, you know, I reviewed the 2 biographies of Ayn Rand that came out last year, and you know, sales have zoomed. I mean, some of the stuff that you read about the Tea Party movement, you know, with grandmas walking around with Federalist Papers, you know, waving the Federalist Papers. No, I mean, I think that's a great story. I think there is renewed interest, but certainly not in the news media where I work, and you know, in the nation's, you know, academic institutions. But that's, yes.
What's your take on Bernanke and his cadre's ability to deal with the money supplies?
Well, I happen to like Bernanke. I think he's a man of integrity that wants to do the right thing. I also know that the Fed usually doesn't get things right, and this idea, I don't know how technically you want me to get that. You know, they're going to use the interest rate on excess reserves to prevent the banks from lending them out. Well, what's the risk-free rate you have to pay these banks to when the economy is expanding and banks are lending again and credit is less risky? What rate are you going to have to pay to prevent this bank or that bank from lending it out? I think unfortunately we will end up with more inflation, but I don't think, you know, Ben Bernanke is Arthur Burns to Richard Nixon, which is, you know, we're going to expand the money supply for the 72 election. You know, technically, do they have the tools? Yes, but the fact is, it still seems to me that they have to sell assets. How can you lock up $1 trillion and keep repoing it out? I mean, you can do that, but I just don't think that is the solution. So we live in interesting times. Back there? Yes, you in the black turtle. Well, I mean, it's changed. I mean, newspapers are closing, cutting staffs, revenue is down, ad revenue is down. Yes, it's changing a lot. You know, I mean, the risk is you get some of these situations where something starts on a blog and becomes fact. You know, the story about the New York Times having a scandalous story on David Patterson, governor of New York, and, you know, his sexual exploits started on some blog. You know, it turned out they were working a story on his top aide and what he did to try and interfere with that. But information is good, but I think a lot of people see anything they read on a blog or a website as fact. But it's good to have sources of information. I think, unfortunately, the newspaper industry is continuing to die. I mean, Bloomberg bought Business Week. And we also have a monthly magazine. I can't imagine how you can do a monthly magazine in this day and age. How can you plan something with a lead time of they're working 3 months before? Either someone's done the story, it's reversed, or something like that. It's very hard. I don't think we're going backwards, though, although I still read physical newspapers. I like them on the train in the morning on the way to work. I'm a Luddite in that sense. Yes?
There's been a lot of articles here, a number of books on the issues of mathematics. I think the fonts, Austrian birds up flying, black swan was on the
Yeah.
Is there any perception now in journalism that somehow this how we mathematics economics has lost its way?
Well, since I'm not trained as an economist and I couldn't do the math anyway, I always had to rely on the intuition. But I don't know if you'd say in the journalistic profession. I mean, it seems to me risk management, which is, we'll get better risk management, and we'll have a financial stability regulator that's going to look out and find out where this is before it, upends the system again. I don't think that's particularly a journalistic question. I mean, they're big econometric models. I don't see anything happening to, for firms to move away from that sort of forecasting. I don't really, I'm trying to think, I don't really talk to use model-driven stuff. I mean, sometimes I like to know what a consensus forecast is, and I'll use a survey or something like that. I don't know that the journalistic profession is that tuned into models. Yeah. Mm-hmm. But this wasn't a journalist. This was someone in the economics profession. I think. Sorry. Oh, yeah. I remember reading that. I think it's one of those preaching to the converted. I think that the people believe in them just believe there was something about the input to the model that was wrong, and those that don't still think there's no good. So, back there. I don't know any more that's been in the press, so I really can't shed any light on that. There. Oh boy. What do I like? I read the Journal's editorial page regularly. I read the Times too, because as I said, sometimes I get my best ideas from bad stuff. So, trying to think who I read. I look at a lot of the blogs. I look at Mises. I look at econlibrary.com. I don't know what the name is. I'm just drawing a blank. I'm not Sarah Palin. I really do read, but I'm just, I read so much in the course of the day, and it's all a little bit different. I have columnists I like, I have economists that I do like, research that I read. So there's an Austrian, Mies Shedlock. I don't know if you know him. Misch's Global Economic. I thought he's pretty popular among the Austrians. So that's that. If I think of anything, I'll let you know. Yes, back there?
Just a comment.
Correct, exactly. 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 Like, what's the difference between paying banks to hold excess reserves and increasing the money supply? Nothing. I did a piece earlier this year, and it's really far out, but for the first time ever, the Fed has low-yielding fixed-rate assets. It has all these mortgage-backed securities. 4%, something like that. It doesn't own a lot of T-bills. In the old days, in a rising rate environment, it used to benefit from reinvesting at higher rates. On the other hand, it's going to have floating rate liabilities. You could get a point where if the funds rate goes, by rough calculation, to something like 7%, that the Fed is no longer self-financing. And I think if the Fed had to go to Congress, for an appropriation, that would even be worse than what we have now. So yes? Well, I think in the last 20 years, when the Bank of New Zealand, went to a inflation target, and I think actually the central bank governor could lose his job if he didn't reach that target. I mean, I think inflation targeting helped a lot of countries that hadn't been able to solve. I know the Austrians think an increase in the money supply is inflation, but I'm talking about inflation as most economists define it, as an increase in the price level. The problem, as I see it, is that the Fed, for example, does not tolerate deflation. So while you can say, they define price stability as 2% inflation a year. Well, at 2.5%, I think the dollar loses its purchasing power in 35 years. So what it may be price stability today, which, Mr. Greenspan used to define as inflation so low that it's not a factor in business or consumer decision making. So what they call price stability in a 1-year time frame is certainly not price stability over the long run. And by definition, they never tolerate a CPI of negative 1%. And there's not much difference between 1% and negative 1%. Tell me what your question again was. I went off on a tangent. What's going on in monetary policy? Well, certainly the Europeans now are having to struggle with the issue of having one central bank and 16 sovereign states. So I think that's an interesting something to watch about how that works out. I don't know. I notice when you go to a lot of the central bank, the inflation targeting websites, they are a lot more transparent than the Fed's website. I mean, the Fed has a good website, lots of research, statistics, but, the ECB is very specific about, their monetary stuff and other stuff. And it just, I think it makes a difference. I think that the transparency that some of these countries and central banks never had is a big plus. Yes.
Do you think that the Treasury will, in any sort of short-term time frame, 5 to 10 years, experience an auction where it can't sell all its T-bills?
I have a favorite saying. During these times when interest rates are going up, the Treasury would always send out someone, from domestic finance to say, the Treasury will have no trouble selling its debt. I like to say the only question is at what price? And I still think that's the answer. I mean, would we have a failed auction? Can you imagine that in this country? I mean, demand for Treasury still seems to be quite strong. So, back there.
You mentioned the euro. Do you think there's a decent shot that a country like Greece or one of the other so-called countries could depart from the euro?
Well, I think Margaret Thatcher gave the euro like a couple years, and in her time she said, the currency, the common currency wouldn't last. I think these countries appreciate the advantage of being in the Union, and not having looked at Greece's books, I don't know what will happen, but I really don't have a view on whether they would choose to leave so they could inflate, or it looks to me like they're trying. I mean, they lied to get into the Union, so why wouldn't they try and stay in there? Anyone else? All right, well, thank you.